Hello, and welcome to the Advisory Committee on Transparency's Transparency Lightning Talks event. I'm Ginger Quintero McCall, the Legal Director of Demand Progress. We are excited to present to you big ideas in transparency and government accountability from a broad array of expert viewpoints. We invite you to sign up for our newsletter, First Branch Forecast, at firstbranchforecast.com to find out about future events and stay updated on important developments in transparency, accountability, and good government. In order to maximize the time we have for panelist talks, we'll be skipping the usual recitation of panelist bios and will instead be putting each panelist bio in the Zoom chat as they begin speaking. And a reminder for our panelists, please share your presentation screens on Zoom so that you can control the advancement of your own slides. Thank you again, audience and panelists, for joining us. And now our first speaker, Walter Shaub, Senior Ethics Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight on the need to create a government ethics records database.
Great. Hopefully I'll succeed in sharing my screen here. Sorry, I'm having trouble. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Can you re-enable that?
I am just going to give our expert on tech, Taylor, a minute to fix that.
You are good to go.
Perfect. Thank you, Taylor.
All right, here we go. And I don't know how to minimize this thing to get it out of the way for you. There we go. Okay, sorry for that delay. I'm Walt Shaub from the Project on Government Oversight, and I want to talk to you during this lightning round on the need for a public government ethics records database. And we begin by looking at the state of the law. There are ethics laws that give the public a right to access several types of records. These are public financial disclosures, waivers, certificates of divestiture, travel records, and those are available specifically under specific release statutes. Other documents like ethics agreements are accessible through FOIA. If you go to OGE's website, you'll actually see financial disclosure reports of nominees and appointees to Senate confirmed positions. That's PAS for presidential appointee to a Senate confirmed position. In the colored brackets, I've indicated the source of authority for that. That's the Ethics in Government Act. You'll also find ethics pledge waivers, ethics agreement, and ethics compliance certification forms. Now, OGE has proactively posted those under the Freedom of Information Act, which is important to remember because my point is going to be that they can do that with a lot of other types of records. They also post certain travel records. These are records of reimbursement from outside sources for official travel. Now let's talk about the problem with the current structure. One of the issues is that lots of documents exist, but you don't know they exist. For instance, there are 2.1 million civilian federal employees, and neither I nor any of you have any clue which of them have received conflict of interest waivers, allowing them to participate in things that affect their financial interest. You can access them, but only if you file a request with the issuing agency. Even though OGE has a copy of it, the law doesn't allow OGE to release it directly. So you not only have to know who has a waiver, you have to know what agency issued it. The public has no way to know when they're issued. And to give you a frame of reference, there were 409 waivers issued just last year. So if we talk about the last 6 years, you're talking about 2,400 waivers. Except for Senate confirmed appointees, requests for financial disclosure also have to be filed with the employing agencies, not OGE. And there were over 26,000 disclosures filed last year. Agencies received only a little over 500 requests for disclosures last year, which means that the public is not seeking these disclosures. And part of that is because agencies are slower to respond than OGE is. OGE has largely automated the process, and you'll often get a disclosure that you request from OGE within a couple hours. Another problem is that at the end of each administration, White House disclosures go directly to NARA before the public can ever see them. Let's say a departing White House employee quits on the morning of January 20th, well, they have 30 days to file their disclosure, their termination financial disclosure. So they file it in February, but by then, NARA is already seizing all White House records, so the public never even has an opportunity to request these. And that's because NARA says it won't release them under the Ethics in Government Act. They say that's the White House's responsibility, but the White House no longer has these records to release. And for instance, the Biden administration doesn't have any Trump administration disclosures to release in the first place. So they're available for 6 years, but you can't get them. This fall, POGO persuaded NARA to agree to post all of these on their website without even requiring a request under the Presidential Records Act. NARA hasn't done that yet, and they say it's a slow process that'll be completed sometime next year. But even then, the public won't know to go to NARA's website to see these. Many records are available only through the Freedom of Information Act, and we all know how slow that is. Last year, DOD, for example, had 22,000 pending FOIA requests at the end of the year, which is a 22% increase over the prior year. And there's no guarantee that the ethics waivers are going to be released. Beyond that, the public has no idea when these ethics records have been issued. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say a general or a senior agency official is invited to attend the Preakness Stakes. That's the horse race a week after or 2 weeks after the Kentucky Derby, where an agency contractor is hosting a reception in a party tent. By the way, this one's not a hypothetical. This one actually happened. The agency ethics official makes a questionable decision to let the official not only accept the free attendance at both the reception, but also the horse race. The public didn't know it happened, so the public didn't know to file a request for the written authorization that the agency ethics official gave to let the person attend essentially a party thrown by an agency contractor at a horse race. So there's a solution we can do, and it's not going to cost anything. This is one of the rare times when Congress, or frankly, the administration, could solve a problem at no extra cost to the public. They could create a centralized ethics records database. OGE already proactively releases some records online, as I said, under FOIA, which I flagged earlier. The Senate confirmed ethics agreements are an example. And in cases where the law requires a written request before the agency can release them, as in the case of conflict of interest waivers under 18 U.S.C. 208, OGE can leverage an existing system that it's already built that automates the submission of requests and processes responses. In fact, the process would be fully automated, except that when I was at OGE, we were afraid we would make news headlines if Bart Simpson or Mickey Mouse filed too many requests. So the process is fully automated, except that a human just has to review the response before hitting release. And if anything looks weird, call the person. But it's an almost fully automated system. I don't recommend we do this for all 2.1 million federal employees. I think the target group could easily just be non-career, meaning political appointees, non-career officials at the GS-15 Senior Executive Service, presidential appointee, or presidential appointee in a Senate confirmed position, including SGEs, special government employees. So that is a universe of roughly probably 6,000 or 7,000 people as opposed to 2.1 million people. And it would be all of their ethics records except for records of individual advice. And the reason to exclude those is the entire prevention system, that is the ethics program, depends on people voluntarily coming for advice. And if they knew the records of that advice would be released, they would just stop coming, and then we would have more ethics violations. So I think that's a reasonable exception. And I also think the scope of all political appointees at the GS-15 level and above gives the public access to the people with the most power to do harm in the government. The benefit is it increases the public's capacity to monitor ethics officials by giving them a centralized and frankly much faster source than individual agencies for public access to ethics records. It also solves the problem of the public not knowing what records to request, because even in cases where you have to submit a request, there would be a list on OGE's website, as there is now, for the list of records that you could request. So you would see, for instance, a written authorization under 5 U.S.C. section 2635.502 or under 2635.204, the gift rules, for written authorization to attend the Preakness Stakes, and that certainly would pique your interest. It also has a benefit to the government because it increases the public's awareness of systems in place to protect government integrity by giving the public access to these records. And it gives the public access to copies of White House disclosures before and after the originals go to NARA. So we don't have this problem every 4 or 8 years of White House records being seized by NARA and left unavailable to the public. Interestingly, although some ethics officials are likely to complain, the truth is the overall burden on the agency is reduced because agency FOIA officials won't have to process FOIA requests for any of these records. It would simply be a proactive process that when an ethics official creates the record, they submit it to OGE. Agencies would be responsible for any redactions, which would avoid a strain on OGE's tiny staff, but it would also give the agency control over the things they want to redact. And then a member of the public, if they wanted to challenge that, could file a FOIA request and sue over any redactions. OGE might even be able to create an automated portal for agencies to post these records directly to the database without OGE's involvement. While I was at OGE, I talked to my computer staff about it, and at that time, they felt fairly confident that they could build this system. And finally, I have 2 more slides. The next one contains a list of records that should be included. Now, I really don't want you to feel overwhelmed and feel like you have to be able to read this. The goal is really to show you how many types there are, and I can always release a copy of this slide so that you can see it later if there's interest. But this is the list of records that could be kept in the ethics records database. It's quite a long list. You see it fills this entire page. And I want to show you in the next slide which of these things are actually currently available online. Boy, that's a big drop off. Again, here's what we want, here's what exists, and it would cost Congress and the administration absolutely nothing to create this, other than minimal additional staff time. So thanks, that's my pitch for an ethics records database.
Thank you, Walter. That was a very effective final slide. Great visuals. Next up, we have Erica Newland, Counsel at Protect Democracy on Congressional Oversight and Congressional Lawyering as Transparency Issues. Erica?
And I'm realizing that I don't have system permission yet to share my screen. Hold 1 second, I'm trying to fix that. It's on your end, not mine. Ginger, would it be possible either to skip me or for you to show my slides, as I'm having some admin permission problems?
Let me see what Taylor says. Taylor.
You should have. Okay.
It's not on your
Erica.
end, it's on my end.
Okay, gotcha.
So are we good to go?
You should have permission.
It's a problem on my end. I have to, it looks like
Okay.
either or
So
something. Do that.
let's go ahead and we will put you a little bit later in the queue.
That
We
sounds
can
great.
move on to Freddy. Freddy, if you are prepared. Perfect. And this is Freddy Martinez, Policy Analyst at Open the Government on FOIA and reform efforts. Thank you, Freddy.
Thank you, Ginger. So this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. FOIA is an extremely important tool for the public to access records of the executive branch. It's led to Pulitzer Prize winning investigations. It's exposed waste, fraud, and abuse by administrations of every political leaning. And it is really one of the most important laws that the public has to know to describe it, how the Supreme Court said, to know what the government is up to. And FOIA is being used more and more by the public. Hundreds of thousands of requests, nearing almost 1 million a year. And the growing use of FOIA means that while the public is more aware of its importance than ever, it also means that the growth is showing real strains and real faults with the law so far. And I'll talk very briefly about some of those faults. The first one is redaction. So the government is allowed to exempt information that under a series of categories that are supposed to be narrowly construed, but FOIA has a sort of internal attention in its design. There are agency interests to protect, which exemptions are supposed to do, versus the public's interest to and the public's right to know. And we find overwhelmingly that when we come into this tension, agencies will just abuse exemptions, use them unnecessarily, and there is very little recourse for the public to challenge exemptions. The other big problem, as Walter alluded to, is delays. Sometimes it'll take years or decades to get records back. In fact, right now, people are waiting longer than ever to even initiate litigation to get FOIA records back. So even when you can litigate over a FOIA request, people are even waiting even longer than ever in that scenario. When people do sue agencies to get records, it is not uncommon for a judge to order a production schedule of 500 pages a month. That doesn't mean you get 500 pages a month. It means that agency officials will review 500 pages a month and will make a determination on those records. So it's not uncommon to file a lawsuit, and then every month, sometimes you'll get no records or duplicate records or records that are completely redacted. Litigation in the FOIA space has exploded in the last 10 years. And the primary reason is that often it's the fastest way to get records, but it's also the costliest for both requesters and agencies. These cases can drag on for years because, as I said, agencies are only sometimes required to review 500 pages a month, which is really what they should have been doing in the first place, which is basically they're processing FOIA requests as they should have been doing the entire time. But now you have a lawyer looking over their back, and it slows everything down and just makes everything far more costlier. And there are limitations with litigation as well. When people challenge the use of exemptions, judges side with agencies over 90% of the time. And the basic premise of judicial review means that judges are really deciding is what kind of information is exempt, not actually what is presumed to be open to the public, right? Because the very nature of these cases is, does this exemption apply in this scenario or not? And over time, we just keep seeing that volume of what is exempt, as decided by judges, just keeps growing and growing and growing. So what can we do? First of all, we need champions on the Hill for transparency. When there are, these massive infrastructure bills, NDAA, Build Back Better, we need people to really take a look at how does this touch transparency? How does this touch FOIA? So that's like the one takeaway that I recommend people take from today. Like, we need champions on transparency, especially with FOIA. We need reforms that maximize proactive disclosure. Things like the calendar agency heads are routinely requested, and there's no reason that FOIA statute can't just dictate that those be proactively disclosed. We need improvement to agency budgets through appropriations. So, for example, this appropriation cycle dedicated a small bump to Interior to reduce their FOIA backlog, and the same amount last year helped reduce their backlog by 5%. So these kinds of things can be done through appropriations, and we have seen some success in that. We also need to strengthen judicial review. We need to let judges know that they can do and order far more than just 500 pages a month. They can order agencies to do additional searches, sit for depositions, all sorts of things that they really don't want to do right now. Reforms could also include the use of a public interest balancing test, right? Right now, exemptions only say it does. Right now with exemptions, there's basically one or two tests. Does the exemption apply or not? And that's basically all judges can decide, which basically means that if a record is, let's say a hypothetical here related to the president's, decisions on 1/6, basically all the judge could ever decide is there an executive branch privilege, yes or no? But obviously there's a huge public interest in these kinds of records that we just can't consider. So we need some kind of public interest balancing test. Finally, Congress could mandate expanded electronic access to records. So FOIA officials right now are not required to have direct access to the electronic records that they would ultimately search, read, redact, and release. And Congress could just dictate that. And I think that's what I have. Thanks, Ginger. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, a lot of those reforms are things that are very dear to our hearts here at Demand Progress, especially as someone who's previously worked on FOIA in a federal agency. You know, FOIA officers and anyone working on processing FOIA requests really needs to have access to the documents themselves instead of relying on some subject matter expert to respond to their emails and give them the relevant documents. So I think that would be a particularly meaningful reform. And we are going to go back now to Erica. Erica Newland at Protect Democracy. We turn to you.
I am still having trouble sharing my screen. I apologize for that. That is a tech problem on my end. Would you? I think you all have it up if you'd be able to do that.
Great. Taylor, can we put Erica's slides up?
Sure thing. Give me 1 second.
Great. And Erica, you can just say next slide.
Sounds great. Thank you so
and
much.
Taylor will advance the slides. And thank you especially to Taylor Swift at Demand Progress for his work behind the scenes on this event.
Thank you for that. And I can just go ahead and start and say thank you. So I'm talking about congressional oversight and congressional lawyering as transparency issues, and we can go on to the next slide. I'm counsel at Protect Democracy, and before I came to Protect Democracy, I worked at the Office of Legal Counsel. You can see a photo of the hallway where the Office of Legal Counsel is at the Department of Justice. And while I was at the Office of Legal Counsel, I developed, one could call it an appreciation, certainly an understanding that of the dominant perspective on separation of powers within the executive branch. And that perspective you can see here from a choice James Madison quote. We can find James Madison quotes that cut completely in the other direction. But this particular one is basically ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Congress and the executive branch are at war, they are in battle, and the best way to promote constitutional interests is to kind of fight each other. I don't particularly endorse that view, but when that's the view that the executive branch adopts, it's important for Congress to understand it and to bring some ambition of its own. So let's go to the next slide. So Congress needs to bring it. What does it mean for Congress to bring it? Step one, ensure that congressional subpoenas for testimony and for information are enforceable. There's a whole history here I could go through about how we've ended up in the current situation where the executive branch often feels like it can ignore congressional subpoenas. I won't bore you with that. Instead, I'll tell you what we should do to fix it. There is legislation right now, Title IV of the Protecting Our Democracy Act, HR 5314. A companion bill has not yet been introduced in the Senate. And the bill would do three basic things. Number one, create clear requirements for compliance. Actually say that you have to respond and create a statutory right. Next slide. Number two, expedite civil enforcement procedures so that the executive branch can't run out the clock as we saw happen in the prior administration. This would mean creating an explicit right of action for the House and Senate, so you can't have like litigation over one actually exists or not, and providing a direct appeal to the Supreme Court from the district court so that the Court of Appeals don't become a place where the litigation slows down. Also preserve the interbranch accommodation process because that is important. And litigation would probably act as a backstop here, right? You wouldn't actually litigate all the time, but knowing that it's actually a real threat and a timely one makes accommodation work better and in a more balanced way. And finally, enhance deterrence for noncompliance by authorizing courts to impose monetary penalties for certain subpoena recipients at high enough levels of government. Continue. So step two, what else can you do? They're bringing lawyers. Congress needs to bring lawyers. Counteract their lawyering with your lawyering. Next step. So one way that the executive branch exerts its power is by releasing opinions. That's actually a transparent move, executive branch OLC opinions, or just advertising the existence of opinions that say the executive branch can't do something. And in setting forth legal arguments or advertising the fact that they exist, the executive branch is taking advantage of the notion that because something is backed up by lawyers, it must be lawful, right? That lawyering and lawful are equivalent words, and they're not. These opinions often have a strong ratcheting effect, where like one slightly stretched argument gets built on top of another slightly stretched argument, gets built on top of another, and next thing you know, we're kind of pretty far from a place where Congress is empowered or where the constitutional checks and balances are working as they should. I want to give some credit to this administration, which I think has done a decent job so far on some particular oversight issues, but there's still many years to go. And so on Congress's end, we need more ambition to counteract the ambition. The Select Committee on Modernization has recommended that the GAO examine the feasibility and effectiveness of a congressional OLC, right? Lawyers to match their lawyers. This was actually, I hadn't realized this till recently, proposed in the 1970s as part of the post-Watergate reforms, put into a few different bills. But the executive branch pushed back, and there were, various things got lost in debates, and it never actually happened. So what could such an office do? It can respond to or make available to congressional offices, depending on how it's designed, potential responses to executive branch analyses on separation of powers issues. We have offices saying to us all the time, well, the executive branch says we just can't do this. And congressional OLC would help you explain why actually you can. Now there are challenges, right? Congress is, look, all branches of government are political, Congress expressly so. And if there's divided Senate and House, what does a congressional OLC look like in a situation like that? I think these are things that implementation can solve for. And there may be areas of focus that are more direct to Congress's interests, such as the interest of ranking members to get information from the executive branch, which Senator Grassley and Senator Wicker were leading the charge on during the Trump administration, and which should be a bipartisan issue. So there may be places where we can kind of take advantage of shared bipartisan interests. And so these are important implementation questions for GAO to take up. Stay tuned on this one. And that is it. I wanted to thank everyone and apologize again for the technical difficulties. And thank you, Taylor, for taking us through the slides so well.
Thank you, Erica. Obviously, OLC issues are something that we've been working at a lot on demand progress's end, and so it would be great to see a robust OLC within Congress, of course, with the proper transparency built in, but that would be a very good idea. And next up, we have Anna Massoglia, Investigative Researcher at OpenSecrets on transparency around foreign money in US elections. And Anna, you can go ahead and start your screen sharing now.
Hi, I'm Anna Masolia. I'm here to talk today about foreign money in US politics with a specific focus on US elections. And geez, let me just hopefully that works. Great. Oh, can everyone see my screen all right? I'm not sure if that just presented okay. Well, great. I'm not sure why.
Anna, it was working when you did that a minute ago.
Okay, good. Perfect. 1 second. So foreign nationals are prohibited from being involved in US politics, from giving to political groups, or being involved in other ways. However, there is a whole smorgasbord of different avenues through which foreign nationals are still able to get involved in US politics through less transparent means. And this is just one menu of ways that foreign nationals have gotten involved recently. And sorry, I'm having a little trouble getting this to load. 1 second. Sorry, some notes that are not loading. And so foreign donors can pour money into US elections in this wide range of issues. An FEC Inspector General report recently revealed that the FEC does not even have a written policy or protocol to verify the donors have foreign addresses or not foreign nationals. And that's just basic direct foreign donations. There's a number of other issues through which foreign donors are able to quietly steer money into US politics, and even more money goes undetected. So who is a foreign national? This could be anything from a foreign citizen who is not a dual citizen to immigrants who are not permanent residents, foreign governments, foreign political parties, which would be what traditionally people think of when they think of foreign nationals, to foreign corporations, associations, and partnerships. One thing that is particularly noteworthy is that the FEC is still issuing guidance on a number of different clarifications on what is a foreign national. Just recently, they noted in a case that DACA recipients are also considered foreign nationals subject to prohibition. Things that are not foreign nationals include US citizens, as well as green card holders and foreign companies that are not under the control of a foreign national who is part of their parent company. And so there's a lot of different ways that that could be further clarified, which I'll get into more later. One of the bigger issues with foreign nationals pouring money into US elections is straw donor cases, where we've seen attempts to funnel foreign money into presidential elections, congressional races, where the source of the funding is hidden by disclosing either individuals or corporations that are not the actual source of funding in the FEC filings. It's not only illegal to funnel foreign money into US elections, but also to knowingly accept it, to make false statements about it, or to knowingly list someone who is not the actual donor behind these elections. Just last month, we saw this, a grand jury indict Jeff Fortenberry, the Congress member, who been knowingly making false statements to the FBI in relation to the Gilbert Chagri case. This is an example of how straw donor cases work, where we see the number of straw donors funneling money from a foreign national to a number of different campaigns, listing the names of these individuals rather than the ultimate source of funds. This becomes an issue because it's a very opaque way through which a foreign national is able to funnel money into US elections. This is another recent straw donor case, just to give other examples. It's one of just the latest developments in a long string of recent straw donor cases, and I won't go into all of the details of that, but another recent case involved Rudy Giuliani, Soviet-born business associates, and with this case, it was not just funneling money through individuals, but also through LLCs and corporations. We saw an LLC called Global Energy Producers, and this adds another layer of secrecy to the straw donor cases, where you're not just having individuals' names, but also these black boxes of LLCs that individuals are able to funnel money into the straw donor schemes through. And LLCs and shell companies are one of the bigger loopholes through which not only can foreign nationals, but through which secret money can funnel into US elections generally. Foreign nationals are barred from spending on US elections, of course, but they can still create LLCs to act as conduits for secretly influencing US elections, as a part of straw donor schemes, but also just can pour money in generally, either just through a single contribution. This, of course, is illegal, but is very difficult to detect. Super PACs accept millions of dollars each year from limited liability companies. This is something that has increased dramatically in recent years, with some cycles seeing tens of millions of dollars in contributions to super PACs from LLCs, many of which have no ties to specific individuals, and in some cases the donor behind that remains a mystery, and there have been no ramifications for the individuals whatsoever. This is why it's so important to implement effective disclosure regimes such as beneficial ownership, to expose foreign actors secretly trying to influence US elections and trying to pour money through LLCs where they may not have their name on the LLC, because LLC disclosure rules are so limited in the United States. There are a number of different states where the beneficial owner who is actually benefiting from the LLC is not required to be listed, where they can hire an agent to act on their behalf, funnel money into US politics. And so beneficial ownership rules are really important for that, so that you can see who plays a significant financing role in that LLC, as well as just who's helping operate it, so that you're seeing more than just the operators, you're actually seeing who the foreign national is behind it. And lack of financial transparency in these corporate disclosures for LLCs is not the only issue that poses for foreign nationals. We're also seeing issues with dark money. It's nearly impossible to get a comprehensive total of how much foreign money is coming in through dark money groups such as 501c4s because there is so much a lack of disclosure. We do get some information from their tax returns, but since the vast majority of dark money spending and their donors are completely not disclosed, the vast majority of the funding is completely untraceable. And so we do know, however, from their tax records that multiple politically active nonprofits in recent years, including top spenders, have reported foreign activities, foreign bank accounts, foreign investments, spending on foreign activities, foreign fundraising. And so we know that there is a foreign connection for a number of the biggest spenders, but we do not necessarily know what that looks like, what those details are, and how much of that was actually political, if any. And so this is just one example of a top group. And it's important to note that a 2020 Government Accountability Office report revealed that the IRS doesn't even check nonprofit tax records for signs of illegal foreign activity. They don't consider that their job. And so we have these multiple federal agencies who are technically responsible for oversight of dark money groups, 501c4s, but instead of having too much oversight, we have agencies just pointing fingers at each other, and that becomes a problem. And one of the bigger loopholes with dark money groups is issue advocacy. Dark money groups are able to spend on directly on US elections, but because when they do spend on things like vote for, vote against, where they use these magic words of express advocacy, they're legally required to report that spending to the Federal Election Commission. Often groups will then resort to what's called issue ads or electioneering communications, where they will instead attack or support a candidate in a way that avoids those magic words and thus will not have to be disclosed to the Federal Election Commission. In particular, if this is an online advertising, it's not required to be disclosed at all. Whereas if it's in more traditional advertising, such as TV or radio, it's required to be disclosed in the 30 or 60-day window before elections. But if it's online advertising, it's oftentimes not required to be disclosed at all, which is a really significant loophole because the FEC has not brought those regulations up to speed as much as a number of other things. And this is just an example of how much money we saw in the 2020 election. We saw more than $1 billion in dark money pour in. Only about 90 million, 88 million was actually reported to FEC as spending. So that's the vote for, vote against, or the electioneering communications that took place in that window before the election. The vast majority of this was contributions to other political groups like super PACs. So that's gray money spending, was TV advertising spending that was issue advocacy, or was digital ad spending, which goes completely unreported in the vast majority of that to the FEC. And that totaled $1 billion just in the 2020 election cycle alone. This is why it's so important to have more clarity about dark money groups, more disclosure. One of the other issues, in addition to the IRS not seeing foreign oversight as one of their roles with politicking, perhaps that might not being an issue depending on who looks at it, is the lack of bright line disclosure rules with politicking for dark money groups, not just in the context of foreign influence, but just in the context of politicking more generally. It's the generally accepted rule of thumb is that these nonprofits are not allowed to spend more than half of their activities on politicking. However, there really isn't a bright line rule to enforce this, and lack of meaningful clarification from the IRS or on the FEC on how much politicking is too much for these groups leaves them free rein to just spend millions and millions of dollars on elections without disclosing their donors most election cycles. And just to move on to a few other ways that foreign influence can funnel into US elections, we saw a lot of movement on ballot measures over the last 2 weeks. And so I added some information on this just because it became such a hot issue. The FEC recently found that foreign donors can finance US ballot measure committees under federal campaign finance law. And at least 7 states have already passed legislation banning this. So we're seeing different rules throughout the country depending on what part of the country you're in. One thing that's important to note is that even if you're not in a state or a municipality that bans foreign nationals from even if you are in a state that bans foreign nationals from participating, you could also be an affiliate of a foreign company. So like a subsidiary or a branch of a foreign company, and you're still legally able to spend because the FEC makes that distinction, and generally most states do as well. But this means that now in states that do not bar this, foreign companies are able to spend directly to influence voters, to influence policy at the state and local level, even though they're not legally able to spend to influence candidates for public office. So effectively, they're now just able to skip the middleman and start influencing policy and influence voters directly. There has been some legislation that tries to fill this loophole. The Stop Foreign Interference in Ballot Measures Act would expand the definition of elections in the FECA's foreign national ban to cover ballot initiatives. There was some legislation proposed in the House as well as the Senate, and that is one potential solution for this. Moving on to foreign connected PACs. These are PACs that are affiliated with the foreign-owned companies. So the US affiliates of those companies, they're able to collect contributions from American employees. The foreign nationals who own the parent company are not allowed to participate in decisions about political contributions or that funding, which is the bigger restriction on this. However, we are just seeing substantial funding coming in through these foreign affiliates PACs. In the 2020 election cycle alone, we saw more than 24 million with about an even partisan split. So that was all coming in, and we're receiving even more money coming in through lobbying by these companies and their affiliates. And just to give a quick breakdown of foreign corporations versus their domestic affiliates, what they're allowed to do, what they aren't. Foreign companies are not allowed to finance political contributions at all, at least for candidates in their elections. They're not supposed to be involved in donation decisions or funding. In terms of kind of the gray areas, ballot initiative support in states with restrictions on foreign involvement. So they are able to fund ballot initiatives, as I mentioned, in places that don't have additional restrictions, but in states that have those additional rules, they are not allowed to. One area that foreign nationals and their affiliates have free reign is issue advocacy, which is what I mentioned earlier, issue ads where you can paint a favorable or disfavorable image of a candidate. And there's very few to no limits on spending on this, but also very little clarification. It's a very large loophole in disclosure rules, as well as just with limits generally, whereas foreign companies, US affiliates are not able to give direct contributions to candidates similar to domestic companies. They are able to, they're not able to have foreign national involvement in their funding decisions, but they are able to give ballot initiative support, spending to their affiliated FACs, and similarly able to have issue advocacy. Just to move on to Foreign Agents Registration Act work, I'm not going to go into too much depth with this since this is more policy focused than elections, but foreign agents have reported more than $2.9 billion in spending to influence foreign policy, to influence policy and public opinion under FARA, even more under the Lobbying Disclosure Act. This is more to influence policy and public opinion than anything else. But the reason this is important for elections as well is we've seen significant political contributions from foreign agents and lobbyists during recent election cycles. So basically foreign nationals can't give on their own, but they can still hire foreign lobbyists and foreign agents and foreign lobbyists who are US citizens are able to continue giving political contributions while they're representing their foreign clients. They're not supposed to give on their behalf, but they may sometimes even give to the same lawmakers they're lobbying. And so it gives an unsavory appearance in some circumstances. And we, during the 2020 election cycle, saw $33.5 million in these political contributions. We saw even more coming in through what's called bundling, which is where lobbyists or other fundraisers will collect political contributions from multiple donors and then deliver the money in one large bundle, letting them give even more than they would be able to give as a single individual donor under contribution limits. And we've seen lobbyists who work for foreign interests even land special appointments while working for certain administrations and that they are lobbying. And so effectively having a special appointment in the same administration that they're lobbying for a foreign interest. And there's nothing that is illegal about that. And one other potential issue and way that foreign influence comes into US elections and to influence politics generally is digital media. We've of course seen a lot of coverage on this, so I won't go into too much depth, but the Federal Election Commission, as I mentioned earlier, has really not kept up to date with digital ad disclosure requirements. They're not subject to the same rules as TV and radio and more traditional media. And it's really important for voters to know who is behind the digital ads that are spending to influence how they vote in US elections. Without more disclosure, voters may fall prey to misinformation, to disinformation. They may not know who is trying to influence their vote and what stake they have in the outcome of that election, or if it might even be a foreign interest behind it. And online, it's so much easier for a foreign interest or anyone acting online to give the appearance of being someone else. And so having more effective disclaimer and disclosure requirements to make this information accessible about political ads and media generally in the political space is really very important for providing information to voters so that they can make informed choices within elections. That is pretty much everything for me. That goes over all of the basic ways that foreign influence can go into US elections. And I will stop sharing because I'm pretty sure I've hit my 5-minute mark.
Thank you, Anna. Those do seem like really important loopholes to close. I'm just going to remind panelists we are a bit short on time now, so please do make sure you keep it within the 5 minutes. Also, I encourage panelists who are not speaking at the time to check out the chat. We're getting a lot of great questions there, and it doesn't seem like we're going to have time at the end for audience questions, so the chat is a great way to participate there. Next up, we have Reynold Schweickhardt, Senior Advisor, Lincoln Network, on accelerating innovation in the legislative branch. Thank you, Reynold.
Thank you, Ginger. Let me see if I can share the screen here. So thank you for having me today. My talk is entitled Accelerating Innovation because there's a lot of innovation and people working both inside the legislative branch. Give a shout out to Kirsten Gullickson at the clerk's office and Lisa LaPlante at GPO as two key inside players. And then on the outside, Daniel Schuman and Zach Graves working to influence Congress from the outside. So one of the things I want to point out is there's a lot of great technology. Congress operates a little bit differently sometimes, so it's hard to take off-the-shelf technology and inject it into the House or the Senate. But there's a set of issues around policies that are in place, funding, staff expertise, particularly given staff turnover, in areas where the House and Senate need to coordinate how to herd those cats to get that coordination. And there's some areas, such as legislative drafting, where the ownership of that space is pretty diffuse between appropriators and the Oversight Committee, between the Senate Secretary and the House Clerk, the Legislative Councils, the Government Publishing Office, the Library of Congress, the Congressional Budget Office. And so organizing all of those interests and perspectives to make meaningful change is a very complex process. So things that I'd like people to think about in this space is, what are we doing right? And there's a lot that's being done right, but are we using all of the tools in the toolbox? Are we using all the levers? And to paraphrase James Carville, it's about the members, stupid. So on the external game of creating transparency and accountability, that's less true. But if we're talking about getting innovation taken up inside Congress, we need to think about it through the lens of the individual members. And so how does that innovation meet their needs so that it gets valued and it gets implemented and staff can effectively use it? Part of that question is who helps and who delays innovation in the legislative branch? And of course, how does it get paid for? So one of the successes I'd like to highlight and talk about tweaking just a little bit is some work that Samantha McDonald did with PopVox, created a statistically representative group of constituents to discuss a policy issue with a member of Congress. There were a couple of things that she noted as needs improvement. And I think my perspective on that is, how do you increase the perception and reality among the constituents that their time and their input was valued. And I think looking at this kind of a pilot where you have a member that says, I'm going to work on issue X, I'm going to gather a group of constituents together, we're going to talk about it for a week, and at the end, here's how you made a difference. I am now introducing, HR 1234 that's going to address this issue, and also enables them to leverage the time that they spend by communicating more broadly with the district. And one of the problems, or one of the challenges with these pilots, is once you've got a formula, how do you move it from a single member, to a broader community of members so that it actually makes a difference in the institution? Related thought, this is not directly following, but for staff, how do we make the tools that they're using for innovation part of a toolkit, as opposed to a jammed desk drawer with a bunch of screwdrivers and wrenches in it? One of the interesting things that the House is working on is to create an enterprise constituent management system that's envisioned to have an open framework so that different actors, outside groups, party organizations, vendors can add functionality. So you can have a place where all of the little tools get organized and kept, instead of bunches of little scripts that get forgotten. And then the second thing is, once you have tools, how do you get people to use them effectively? So people like Lorelei Kelly and others are talking about, how do you create playbooks to guide staff through activities, and finally using user-centered design, create tools that people are going to want to use, know how to use, and don't have to go look in the 200-page manual every time they think about using them. So let's talk about sort of barriers to innovation for a second. Staff turnover. So techniques don't get passed down, people are too busy, short tenure. If you think about the generations of communications directors or legislative directors that take place in 10 years in many offices, you end up with 10 or 20 generations. It's pretty easy for good ideas to get lost. I spoke earlier about all of the offices that are engaged in the supply chain for the legislative process, and hopefully listed them all there. The ability of particularly the CMS vendors, which is Hill speak for CRM, to fund innovation given the small population of offices, and how to get internal funding to the right place. And then a big barrier to bringing off-the-shelf technology onto the Hill has been the meeting the cybersecurity and privacy requirements. And I would add the separation of powers issues, sometimes with executive branch technology, so that it can be authorized for use on the Hill. And sometimes too much of a project management focus that doesn't think its way through the desired behavioral end state in offices, sometimes produces things that are interesting, but we haven't actually figured out how to get them into use. So we've got some people that are very good at pushing innovation from the outside. Particularly, I think, the Lincoln Network and Demand Progress in the organized communication with the Modernization Committee and the appropriators. Members are competitive, so sometimes getting them to participate in efforts where they're going to be awarded or recognized. The party organizations, the GOP conference and the Democratic caucus can define goals or set some expectations or targets for members. Obviously, the vendors have a role in improvements. And then the Senate and House officers that run the technology shops can also define minimum functionality that those vendors are supposed to deliver, the funding of specific projects. And an interesting new effort from the chief administrative officer is to get a coaching office to help chiefs of staff by bringing sort of existing knowledge to them when they're trying to solve a problem. And then can we work through some of the staff organizations for chiefs of staff or press comms? As you probably know, staff assistants turn over a lot. So there's this very active listserv where it's like, how do I do this? How do I do that? Where there can be some opportunities to inject some innovation. And money, money, money. So I think that enterprise solutions can be more effective and impactful. So there's current efforts from the CAO to move spending from individual MRAs, members' representational allowances, into the CAO's budget by providing laptops instead of members buying them, which also allows for some better centralization on security and maintenance. And then the enterprise CMS, both of those efforts have been funded out of the MRAs traditionally. And so as the legislative bill is being funded, I'd encourage people to talk to appropriators about thinking about those things that indirectly relieve pressure on the MRA and to provide more central funding to continue those kind of efforts. And the appropriators have been good about generally providing multi-year funding or no-year money for technology projects so that you can plan for that initiative. But there's probably a little room to make that practice a little bit more widespread. One of the challenges is with a lack of funding and too many projects is things don't get done that people want to get done. And so this is, in the before slide, you don't have enough money. Everyone comes to House officers with desired projects. Nobody gets told no. There's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not enough people get told no. So you get a whole bunch of projects underway without meaningful progress. The sponsor finds other alternatives or moves on. The project finally gets done and not enough people care, and that cycle continues. So the current CAO is working on providing more focus to projects, which is good. The CAO is tending to work in administrative space, so not necessarily producing things relevant to transparency, but that accelerates or intensifies the problem of getting new projects started. So it's, to be clear, I think it's good that they're focusing on results, but it also means that good ideas don't immediately get taken up. The other space in Congress for innovation is committees, and there's sort of good news, bad news. So structurally, it's not necessary. It's difficult to figure out whose job it is to help committees fund innovation. So the clerk has historically not gotten involved in the internal operation of committees beyond a set of things that are required in in-house rules. The CAO sometimes thinks that innovation is outside their scope. The good news about committees is they can be laboratories for innovation, but that tends to be personality driven. People remember Chairman Issa at government reform. He had a lot of ideas or a lot of innovations, but they didn't necessarily, spread through the House. In the last 6 or 8 years, I think the most interesting thing in committees has been docs.house.gov to pull committee documents out of internal files or out of disparate processes to make public. And that was effective because it was mandated in House rules and had strong support from the Speaker and Minority Leader to apply to all committees. And so we should be thinking about, in the next Congress, are there other opportunities for shared or enterprise services that a House rule change in the beginning of the next Congress could enable?
Reynold, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Okay, good. We're wrapping it up. I'm just very
Yep,
worried about time right now. We're over time.
Absolutely. So with that, I'd be interested in hearing from anybody with ideas or thoughts, and thank you for your time today. And let me turn this back to you, Ginger.
Thank you so much. And just a reminder to panelists, we have 3 more panelists left. We understand not everyone can stick around, so we do have the recording, which we'd be happy to offer afterward, but panelists, please do keep an eye on the time. And next we go to Corina Turbis, Policy Director at the Data Coalition on Spending Transparency Initiatives included in the passage of the Data Act and GREAT Act and the Congressional Budget Justification Transparency Act. Corina.
Oh, Corina, you are muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just gonna skip ahead to a bit of the end. So we at the Data Coalition are very interested in making sure that there is open data available on government programs, and particularly when it comes to government spending. I think all of us who have ever worked in any sort of advocacy lens definitely understand that this can be a complicated issue and that a lot of our spending information is locked away in PDFs. So the move to get federal spending data as structured data that's available as open data started in 2006 with the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act, which launched usaspending.gov. That was later expanded with the Digital Accountability Transparency Act in 2014, which issued government-wide standards to make data on spending comparable, also instituted unique entity identifiers. In 2019, efforts were expanded again with the Grant Reporting Efficiency and Agreements Transparency Act to do the same thing to grant spending. So not only our regular appropriations expenditures, but also things that were being applied to grants. And then finally, this year, significant progress was made with both the Congressional Budget Justification Transparency Act and the Taxpayers' Right to Know Act. The Taxpayers' Right to Know Act will create an online inventory of government programs, including detailed budget information that will be available online. And then the Congressional Budget Justification Transparency Act will provide the budget justifications provided to Congress by the executive branch in a machine-readable open data format. So for any of you who have had to pour through thousands of documents or thousands of pages of PDFs to find your line item, this act will make that more readily searchable, readily available, and ensure that it lives on a centralized website. Oftentimes we find these dead links of previous years' congressional budget justifications just gone. So the idea here being is creating a sizable data infrastructure that allows advocates and others to look at government spending in a better way. And the reason why we want this open data is because it improves accessibility. It allows people to find this data faster. It makes it more readily available, and that it improves accountability. We are now able to look at where the government spent money and link that to program outcomes. Is this where we want our money to be spent? Is it well spent? Et cetera, going forward. And one thing that can't be underestimated is that by having government budget data available as open data in a machine readable structured format is that it enables some really significant new analytical technologies to be deployed. Instead of having your interns pour through these documents, or yourself or whoever, researchers can write programs to help them do that. We can look at reducing reporting errors. There's a lot of things that can get done in a more rigorous way with this kind of data. So some recommendations for next steps: let's get more data. A lot of implementation still needs to happen on all of these bills, and they're making some big steps forward, but we can look at things like category management. So Freddie mentioned earlier about, is anyone giving plus ups to FOIA to reduce that backlog? That's not necessarily a category across the board, but we could tag our spending data to make sure we do that. We could do it with disaster spending or climate change spending. With sufficient structured data, we could make those kinds of tags. We could look at sub-award reporting. You know, if a grantee receives money, are they sending it out to sub-awards? We could look at checkbook level payments. And then we were talking a lot about the executive branch. We could get appropriations bills into some structured data. So again, we're not pouring through these massive PDFs that are very hard to read and can often lead to user error. And then finally, we could look at this from a revenue side as well, not only government outlays, but intake as well. So there's a lot of, to borrow a phrase from Walter, there's a lot of documents that exist and we don't always know where they are or how they exist. So taking these steps forward to get open data available for government spending is a huge boon to transparency and the analytical portions. And so I think that's 5. And so I'll wrap there.
Thank you so much, Corinna, for respecting the time limits and for those great ideas. Next up, we have Tom Sustin, Strategic Advisor at the American Bar Association on increasing access to legislative branch information. And once again, I will encourage our panelists to engage with the chat. We have some great questions on there, and we won't have any time for audience questions in the presentations. So thank you all.
Okay, good afternoon. My presentation, I'll try to keep it brief, and owes great debt to Demand Progress, to Ginger, to Daniel. They have been leaders in the area of pressing Congress for more transparency across the board, and continue to do so. I think there are 3 letters that are either going out or being circulated right now on various aspects of proactive disclosure. Of course, the Constitution said that congressional proceedings should be public in a journal, and Congress was the only branch of government that really historically had most of its activities, its hearings, discussions, bills available to the public. The judiciary, administrative side of the judiciary remains closed, and the executive branch had to be pried open with the Freedom of Information Act. Yet the Freedom of Information Act specifically exempts Congress from its provisions. And during the decades that I've been involved in FOIA, working with government officials, constantly hear the refrain, if it's good enough for the executive branch, why not Congress? And even Senator Leahy a few years ago introduced a bill to apply FOIA to Congress, but he didn't pursue his own legislation. It isn't unique that legislatures should be subject to open government, right to information, transparency type laws. In both the states and foreign governments, legislatures are often included without limitation. And so it can be done. The recommendation that I have that I've developed, and I think it probably is the one that most observers of Congress would concur, is that the Freedom of Information Act is not well designed for the Congress. FOIA itself has exemptions that would leave internal deliberations, privacy, trade secrets. Most of the things that in congressional offices and committees that aren't already public wouldn't be public. But there are a number of congressional support agencies and offices that perform the same kinds of functions, that personnel management, building maintenance, policing, the kinds of things that agencies, state, local, international, subject to transparency laws and right to information. And those are the ones that should be covered by a FOIA-like law. The support agencies, again, thanks to Daniel Schuman for continuing to collect, all the offices and agencies. And I had never heard of the Open World Institute until gathering this kind of information. But there are a number, they do all sorts of things. They're funded by the taxpayer. They do work that's identical to executive agencies. And most important, they produce information that's important and of interest to the public. Proactive disclosure examples, coincidentally, there are letters out, I think, right now from Demand Progress being signed on by a number of non-NGOs in Washington, asking the Senate to follow the House's lead and post bills in advance, post amendments, not just the first 150 pages on an internal website. So the Senate could certainly make its legislative activities a lot more transparent. Congressional research reports, again, legislation has been approved, but it's CRS is still taking down information, and historical records are not posted by CRS. And then agency reports to Congress that usually go into some staff email and may never see the light of day. There should also be a request and release part of the procedures applicable to Congress. The Copyright Office does it already, GAO does it already, and Congress has asked the Capitol Police, please, would you do it? I think in 2 successive Congresses, report language has first suggested and then requested the Capitol Police to adopt a FOIA-like procedures. So far, no progress in that area. Old committee records and transcripts also of classified proceedings need to be made more available to the public without any, FOIA exemptions can apply, but they need to be released. In the end, the Federal Advisory Committee to the Archivist on Freedom of Information last June adopted a recommendation that the archivist has before him to send to Congress, suggesting what I've been proposing this afternoon, that Congress should adopt rules or enact legislation that are modeled after FOIA procedures that require both proactive disclosure and procedures governing public requests. This is something that ought to be on the congressional agenda, along with a number of other outstanding recommendations that I've heard so far in this program today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And last but certainly not least, we have Ryan Mulvey, Policy Counsel at Americans for Prosperity Foundation on FOIA case law developments in the Supreme Court and circuit courts.
Thanks, Ginger. Let me try to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Is that showing? Okay. Great. So I'll try to be quick. I'm glad there's still people in the audience. So I'd like to highlight some cases and some existing splits that I think are of particular interest to people in the transparency community, or decisions that just have great import. I can't get into detail with all of them, so I'll just try to highlight some key issues in each. Let's start with a recent Supreme Court decision from the beginning of the year in Sierra Club. The records at issue here were draft biological opinions, and the question was the scope of the deliberative process privilege. The Supreme Court, what I'd like to point out as particularly important in discussing whether a record should be protected as deliberative, suggested that courts should attend to whether or not legal consequences flow from the decision-making that the record reflects. This is sort of an importation of Bennett v. Speer, and if you take it at face value, it is a huge expansion of the deliberative process privilege, because there's lots of agency decision-making that doesn't result in legal consequences, and if that's going to be an essential part of the test, requesters are going to be deprived of a lot of information. So it'll be interesting to see how this precedent is taken down into the different jurisdictions over the next couple of months. There's a petition for cert pending right now from the Ninth Circuit in Rojas v. FAA. This deals with Exemption 5's threshold consideration of whether a record is an inter or intra-agency memorandum or letter. Many of the circuits, all of them, in fact, except the Sixth Circuit, have argued that the plain text of the exemption shouldn't be adopted, that we should adopt a functional approach, and outside consultants that assist an agency in its efforts, in its work, should be protected under Exemption 5. The en banc decision here in the Ninth Circuit reversed an earlier panel decision that rejected the consultant corollary. So we'll see if cert gets granted there. Relatedly, there's a Fifth Circuit case, Shaub versus National Transportation Safety Board, which doesn't deal so much with the consultant corollary. It reaffirmed it, but the particular question of whether records with a consultant should qualify as intra-agency because the outside consultant is interested, has an interest in the agency's deliberations. So here, the agency basically seconds representatives of aircraft manufacturers and operators. And in this particular case, the records reflected communications between the agency and such outsiders in a crash involving an helicopter that was designed by the manufacturer and operated by the operator. So there's obviously a conflict of public and private interests there. So we'll see if cert gets granted there. That should be an interesting question. Open FOIA Act from 2009. You may recall that Congress now requires that new Exemption 3 statutes cite to the FOIA in order to be qualifying exemption statutes. This case deals with the 2012 T-Hart rider, which prohibits expenditure of agency funds to release records about firearms tracing. The Ninth Circuit here said that the 2012 T-Hart rider, which doesn't cite to the FOIA, is not a qualifying Exemption 3 statute. Like that's the end of the analysis. This creates a circuit split now with the Second Circuit, which last year said, well, really the Open FOIA Act is an unconstitutional legislative encroachment. A present Congress can't bind a future one. So the 2012 T-Hart rider, even though it doesn't cite to the FOIA, is basically like an implied repeal of the Open FOIA Act. And we shouldn't take that requirement from FOIA too seriously. So we'll see where this circuit goes. I don't think the clock has run out on the ability of the government to appeal in the Ninth Circuit case. So we may see this coming before the Supreme Court relatively soon. As a side note, each of these cases about with the T-Hart rider involved arguments by the agency as a secondary matter that a search would result in the creation of a new record, that the disclosure of database, electronically stored data would entail the creation of a new record. That typically is an agency has no obligation to create a record to respond to a request. But it's also established that the disclosure of existing information in an electronic format shouldn't be entail the creation of a new record, at least for purposes of determining whether the agency has an obligation to process a request. The DC Circuit addressed this year with GPS data. It said a requester could get longitude and latitude data, but the agency couldn't be forced to create maps. So there's all sorts of cases that are coming out about metadata and different types of database stored data. It's a live issue, unfortunately. Subject matter jurisdiction under the FOIA. This is an issue that has come up in a couple of cases, but earlier this summer in a case about access to internet browsing history records, the DC Circuit clarified that agency control, the question of whether a case implicates access to agency records, is a merits question and not a jurisdictional one. And this is great because it preserves the burden on an agency to have to justify its treatment of records. Otherwise, a requester would have to prove in the complaint, plead facts sufficient to prove that the requested materials are agency records, and that is a very difficult thing to do. Foreseeable harm. This is a great case, Reporters Committee versus FBI from July. requesters have been for a long time trying to argue that the foreseeable harm standard imposes a heightened burden on agencies. They have to go beyond technical grounds for applying an exemption or a privilege. The DC Circuit has confirmed that. Reciting the justifications for the use of a privilege isn't enough. You have to give a concrete explanation for why particular records at issue are disclosable, given the context of their creation and the decision making. And we'll see further fights over this because district courts are always trying to pare back the import of the foreseeable harm standard. And as Freddie mentioned, this is an area where public interest balancing test or other reform would be an interesting idea. I'll skip this case. Remedial authority under 552A2. This is FOIA's proactive disclosure requirement, the reading room provision. The Second Circuit recently confirmed that a court can order an agency to comply with its reading room obligations and make records available to the general public. This builds on an existing split between the Ninth Circuit and the DC Circuit. The Second agrees with the Ninth. DC says, no, a court can only order if an agency hasn't posted proactively records it should have in its reading room. It can be required by the court to produce records to an individual requester, to the plaintiff, but it would go beyond the scope of the remedial authority of the court to benefit the general public by enforcing the reading room provision on its own terms. So I expect this to be a decision that comes to the court, and remedial authority of the courts under the FOIA is definitely an area where we need some reform. And then finally, this is an older case, Whitaker versus Department of Commerce, but, and I think Freddie mentioned this is a relevant decision because of the infrastructure bill that passed last week. Several years ago in 2012, Congress created the First Responder Network as part of the Department of Commerce, and it exempted First Responder Network from Chapter 5 of Title 5, the APA, but that includes the FOIA. And the Second Circuit confirmed that the plain language of that broad exemption applies. FOIA is part of the APA, and you're just out of luck. Well, the infrastructure bill last week, with respect to the new broadband equity grant program, that program is exempt. All commerce agency action relating to that program is exempt, not just from Chapter 5, but Chapter 7 of the APA. And this kind of snuck past, I think a lot of people, I don't think Congress even realized what they were doing. So this is a troubling development, and I think it shows why we should all be very attentive to these broad categorical exemptions to the APA for the sake of what the agency claims it needs as flexibility in administering the program, because there will now be absolutely no disclosure, transparency into the expenditure of government funds for this grant program. And that, I think, is particularly troubling. So I thank you for your time.
And yeah, agree that provision for broadband is very troubling. There's a lot of money that's going to go out of the door, and we're going to have no way to monitor where that's going or how effectively it's being used. So I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and thank you to our panel of experts for their great work. Special thanks to my colleague Taylor Swift for his hard work in putting this panel together. And please remember to sign up for the First Branch Forecast newsletter at firstbranchforecast.com so you can stay up to date on our work. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you so much.